Before we discuss Martin Luther's doctrine of justification by faith alone, it's worth spending some time thinking about what prior views in the medieval era were about salvation in the human person. This is laid out within two strands of scholastic theology. And in order to make sense of this, we first ought to consider the overall question of what's the purpose of being human. So the consensus view in Western Christendom was that humans were made out of nothing, creation ex nihilo, in order to share in the divine life. But if we're created from nothing, how can we distinguish our own human ability, our own doing of good, from the operations of divine grace? That is, we have here the classic debate between nature and grace in Christian theology, and Luther is entering into that. Now, we've already seen this debate between nature and grace in the early Christian period when we saw the debate between Pelagius and Augustine of Hippo on the question of original sin. And just to remind us what Augustine's view was, because this emerges as the normative view for the medieval period, Augustine says that salvation is about God healing humans in order to relocate human desire in God and not in ourselves. So sin is desiring what we want selfishly that drives us away from orientation towards God's will. And for Augustine, there's no real distinction between being saved and being healed. That is, the process of salvation is the process of the healing of the will. That's what the sacrament of baptism represents, and that's what the ongoing life in the church provides. The question, though, is, how do you do good before you are healed? Or, again, how do I know whether what I'm doing is good? And is it good because I'm actually being sinful and selfish and thinking something is good? Or am I truly doing good because God's grace is guiding me in it? Now, we see this debate play out in scholastic theology in the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries. And here we can put this into two broad camps. There's a realist camp of Thomas Aquinas, and then there's something called a nominalist camp that could be represented by William of Ockham. So first, Aquinas and the realists. Aquinas wants to argue that there is a logical relationship between God and the world through the use of reason and analogy. That is, this world is a mirroring or provides an ability to reflect upon God through the use of mental operations. We're guided by revelation of Scripture that gives us a clue about who God is. And then there's also the ongoing work of the church that provides us grace to continue to use our reason and our analogous thinking to learn more and more about God. Now, how does salvation happen? This is an action by the grace of God, but it requires humans to have a quality of love that they show through the works they do. Aquinas will define this as there is an effusion of charity into humans by the Holy Spirit. That is, we are baptized, we receive grace, and then we have charity or a love poured into us through that life, and then that shows forth in the good works we do. Salvation, though, is something that's both offered to us and is something that we retain or attain. It's a dynamic relationship that's happening then between nature and grace. And so we would see that Thomas Aquinas' perspective, this realist perspective, helps to endorse the ritual penitential system of which Luther is so critical. On the other hand are the nominalists. This is represented by the school of William of Ockham. Nominalists resist this notion that there's some kind of necessary connection between the created order and divine reality, that there's a bigger gap between the two. And that thus there's no way that there's any kind of good works that we can do that can lead God to simply accept us. And so salvation is really dependent on our will in some ways. The human will on its own can earn God's grace, but God might choose to save people independent from any good works at all. So this is really emphasizing the doctrine of election here. And so there's an emphasis in this perspective on God's providence and sovereignty that then highlights the gap between human nature and divine grace. So there are two schools of thought in operation in Luther's time, of the realist and the nominalist. And in some significant ways, Luther is closer to this nominalist school of William of Ockham. There's also some significant late medieval scholastic changes in theology that are happening here. They're different than, say, what Augustine was up to. So while this notion of being saved in Augustine's theology is very close to this notion of being healed, in the late medieval period, the question of salvation more moves towards a question of acceptance. Does God accept you? As well, this notion of grace has shifted also. Again, whereas Augustine or other early Christian thinkers emphasized grace as a kind of therapy that moves you towards health, now grace is more understood as the merit that leads you to being accepted, or grace as the rewards that one receives for the good intentions that you have. And so some concepts have shifted, and it's important that we understand this shifting. I hope this video helps you get a better sense of what Luther is up to as we move into discussing freedom of a Christian.